Hello, my name is Dr. Val-Addo, and I welcome you to Insights with Dr. Val-Addo. Today's presentation is the 17th in a series. And in today's presentation, we will provide insights into how Africans can measure the national development progress of their countries after independence several decades ago. Now, these insights require sober reflection. We shall cover just three important measurement or assessment yardsticks, and we encourage you to lend us your ears and listen to the end. Now, the first yardstick for measuring and assessing national development in Africa is credible African history. The Reverend Carl C. Randolph, who wrote a very important book in the Gold Coast, he was a Gold Coaster of Danish extraction. One of his parents was from Dane, published a book in 1895, and recently the Ghana University's Press has updated it, defines history as the speculum and measure tape of a nation, showing its true shape and stature. It continues, hence a nation not possessing a history has no true representation of all the stages of its development, whether it is in a state of progress or in a state of retrogression. Fortunately, we have a history written by the Europeans after they came, and it shows how Africans lived before the Europeans arrived. It covered African nature, African personality, African dignity, peaceful coexistence of Africans, and the social systems of African governance on the coasts of Guinea before they came. Now, these came from credible historical accounts of sincere and truthful Europeans who were parties to exploration of the coastlands and wrote about what they observed. And these were compiled again by Anthony Benzet, an European, in 1771. Now, in the future, we will cover other ancient aspects of the African life involving education and economies of Africa. Now, these are very important for us to use them as the basis of measuring our developmental progress in Africa. Unfortunately, the problem African countries have is not including the true or first-hand historical accounts of the Guinea Coast and other parts of Africa and the lessons from them in the educational curriculum and political and economic assessments. Now, for lack of hindsight in African nature, personalities, dignity, coexistence, the environment, social systems, education, there will be no development of proper insights and foresight for modern Africans and the generations ahead. So history, credible African history, is very important for measuring and assessing national development. And it will require our leaders, our politicians, to know this African history so that they will be able to measure their progress and the way they are trying to work to uplift Africa. We want to talk about the second yardstick for measuring and assessing national progress, and that is indigenous African systems of governance. Indigenous African systems of governance. Now, we covered 6 systems of governance, and that was organization, institutions, administrations, morality, law and order, and safety. Now, I will state unequivocally that the social systems put in place by Africans before the coming of Europeans on the Guinea coast of Africa were of distinct qualities. European imperialism and democracy could not match the African indigenous social systems so far discussed in our presentations. Now, let us use the indigenous African systems of governance to measure how modern African countries are doing. Let's take, for instance, organization. Now, there is a problem of African countries in using Western democracy in organizing African countries. And it is through two partisan political parties. Almost all African countries have two political parties. And this type of organization or organizing the nation has led into sharp division of African people. It has divided Africans. And life in Africa has gradually been centered on two-party politics. Citizens appear to be captivated and captured and consumed by two-party systems in their countries. They argue and fight unnecessarily every day because of partisan politics, as if life is all that is. Being patriotic has given way to partisanship and division of a country of one people and with one common destiny. Now, I would like to suggest that we organize our countries better than through partisan politics. And I suggest that if we are going to maintain politics or partisan politics by the European democracy, then I suggest that there should be a strong competing third party in every African nations, so that the two political parties that are famous and very strong will not take their countries for a ride and deceive the people, because it's like a mind game by the two parties of every nation trying to take over 4 years, at most 8 years, and the other people come back. So it is a kind of mind game and a deception about how the country has been organized. Now let's look at our institutions. Ancient African people and groupings succeeded by the institutions they established and enabled them to work. Now, there is a book I have read many years ago. It's called Why Nations Fail. Why Nations Fail. And sometimes nations do not only fail, but they become poor. The authors, Asmuglu and Robinson, highlight how politics determine what institutions a nation has. What they try to explain is that politics determines what institutions a nation has. They went further to highlight how institutions change through political conflict. When there is political conflict, then institutions begin to change and they add. If you go to Ghana now, there is a change of institution of security because they are fighting over, the safety of their political parties, and they have come out with military or security agencies that are causing a lot of trouble. And so you find that institutions of a nation change through political conflict, according to the authors. And they strongly suggest that prosperity and poverty of a nation are determined by incentives created by institutions. That means when institutions create incentives or the nations create incentives for the institutions, they are able either to prosper or to end up in poverty. Now, to get the best in African governance, there is a need for us to review the established national institutions of Africa and determine whether they are independent and free from partisan politics. Are they properly incentivized and independent from the political parties? Are independent offices of ethics established, like the Auditor General's Department, to audit the institutions, to make sure that ethics are followed, to recommend discipline and dismissals for violations? Now, national institutions to be incentivized include safety or security and law and other institutions such as the police, intelligence and investigatory bodies, the courts of competent jurisdiction, and the academia. These institutions contribute a lot to the survival of a nation, to provide safety and security, order, and law. Now, other institutions that we need to look at are non-governmental civil societies that are involved in how a nation is organized, and then also various watchdog societies and the media. Instead of empowering these national institutions, African political parties and ruling governments have turned them partisan, or they have sought to do so. The media in Africa is becoming worse off. In Ghana, for instance, instead of the media inviting people with expertise in the various aspects of the social systems, education, economy, and development, to freely comment and educate citizens on national issues, they invite myopic party communicators or PROs to fill the airwaves with partisan political sensationalism and deafening noise. The Holy Writ says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." If we don't get the right knowledge and pass it on to the citizens by the people that we have educated and trained with all the expertise, then that nation is going to be destroyed. And some of the media houses in Africa, especially in Ghana, are helping to destroy Africans and Africa by the people they bring on the airwaves because they belong to certain famous and well-known political parties. And these people may be very myopic, not experts in certain topics that they talk about. And it is high time Africans rise up to claim their countries from partisan politicians and partisan media. And one day, if we are not very careful, it will happen like the Arab Spring. Indigenous Africa prospered by its indigenous institutions. So is the Western world. Unfortunately, most African citizens of modern African countries are sinking into poverty because of the way national institutions are established, underfunded, and controlled by partisan ruling governments. Apparently, absolute power belongs to these parties, and they appear to be the most privileged class among the citizens of Africa, and that is not fair. To be a politician is to be a servant of the people and not to be a privileged person of the society. Now let's talk about morality. Morality played a very important role in the governance of the indigenous African society. We heard from our previous presentations that adultery, taking somebody's wife, was punishable, heavily punishable by law and sometimes by death. Now, unlike some Western countries, morality is the bedrock of the indigenous African systems. That means morality was the foundation or the bedrock that sustains the African indigenous systems. It promotes ethics, that is right and wrong, human dignity, social cohesion, and peace. Now, Europe and the West do not accept polygamous marriage, which is inherent in almost all African societies. If an African practices a polygamous marriage and family in their countries, they will face imprisonment charges and or deportation. Though their official position on marriage is monogamous, that is one man or one husband, one wife, some also have in addition girlfriends and boyfriends, even though they are married. In many European and Western countries, civil marriages by two men called gay or homosexual marriage and marriage by two women called lesbian marriage are allowed. However, they are also unacceptable moral issue in African culture or in their way of life. Africans don't accept that. Just as Europeans don't accept the polygamy of Africans, Africans also do not accept a man and a man marrying and a woman marrying. These are moral issues in both parts of the world. And so the Western world and the Europe have a moral issue not to allow polygamy, though it is accepted in Africa. And then Africans also do not have a culture that embraces lesbianism and homosexuality. So you find that every society that will thrive, that will progress, that will advance, morality is the bedrock. This started with our ancient African history and social systems of governance. Just as the Europeans have protected their countries and the Western world have protected their countries from polygamous marriage so that they will be able to control population, not have many children, many wives, yet they have girlfriends and boyfriends, though married. Even so, Africa should also uphold the morality of our people and not allow homosexuality and lesbianism. It doesn't mean that a man is not a man involved in lesbianism, in homosexuality, or a woman involved in lesbianism is not a human being. No, that person is a human being, but it's a moral issue, unacceptable by our culture. Just as polygamy is unacceptable by the Western and European culture. Now, if they see you, doesn't mean if you are polygamous, if you are in polygamous marriage, you are not a human being. But they don't accept it because it is a moral issue they have accepted in their society to maintain ethics. So let's balance the scales and not allow Europe and the Western world to dictate what kind of morality we have to adopt in 21st century before they give us aid or they give us financial help for development. Unfortunately, it is only South Africa that has legalized civil marriage. All African countries have stood on their grounds on morality in running our countries, in governing our countries, and I applaud our presidents and prime ministers for standing firm. And if in the future they begin to change their mind, then African citizens should rise up and claim the nations from those kind of leaders. Now, the church and its various institutions in Africa and in every country are the salt and the beaming and radiating lights of the societies that uphold morality. They do evangelism to win people to be born anew from sin nature and to be good citizens. They counsel people about life and play a prophetic role in the life of the nations with divine and theological guidance. These are some of the public roles of the church. These have now shifted in many African countries, and in Ghana in particular now, some so-called prophets have been gripped by partisanship. They are also involved in partisan politics, predicting election results for their parties and condemning parties and presidents they oppose. This is unchristian. Hope there will be a Christian way of handling some of these issues. There were prophets who really condemned some social vices in the Old Testament of the Christian or Hebrew scriptures, but they were not involved in predicting partisan elections and belonging to parties and condemning and insulting presidents. That is unchristian and it's unbiblical. Should never be allowed. Now, the third yardstick for measuring and assessing national development is having national development plans, agenda, and ethics. We need national development plans, national development agenda, and national development ethics. In order to ensure that Africa's progress is measured and assessed very well. African politics only deals with infrastructural development projects, especially getting to the time of election so that they can show the citizens what they are doing. Sometimes they do shoddy work with shoddy streets and roads, which are destroyed in the next 6 months for them to win elections without short and long-term life or human development plans. They make roads, shoddy roads, and then people's future are not planned. People's lives are not involved. And we must know that infrastructure development is not the only one, but we need to deal with human development, life development of the citizens, so that the citizens' life will be raised to a standard for us to grow. And we need a national development plans and agenda and ethics to check it. Now, we find that because our politicians are interested in infrastructural development more than human development, they pursue them in order to enable them borrow huge sums of money from Western countries, take their kickbacks and fill their pockets, and to finance and win partisan elections in order to stay in power for a long time. Well, when they do that, they leave African countries with huge debts to Europeans. African countries need independent development watch institutions and civil societies with experts in development ethics to serve as checks to ruling governments in Africa in undertaking development projects. Now, many of you who have studied development know that there is a course, there is a study about development ethics that checks people who are initiating development. There are independent people who are involved in development ethics to check these people to see whether the development they are undertaking is ethically right, and are they accountable, are the accounting systems right. A popular slogan in Ghana is "Who watches the watchman, who holds the three organs of state, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary accountable. Who holds them accountable? They seem to be untouchable. And anybody who finds himself in any of these three systems of the state or the three organs of state is covered. And when they are corrupt, nobody checks them, because it has become a covering for them to practice what we call corruption. So who holds them accountable? Who holds African pastors, prosperity preachers, and prophets in the public domain with all the nuisance they talk about to destroy the people's life? Who holds them accountable? Who assesses African leaders and politicians? There is so much work to do because ethics is not upheld in Africa. Development ethics, leadership ethics, and organs of the state ethics is not in place. So anybody in any of the organs of state, whether legislature, executive, or judiciary, is untouchable, is covered, is protected. It is high time for Africans to know what to do in order to maintain ethics in the African society. Because most of these politicians deceive their fellow Africans that citizens will do so during elections. And so when they elect, it indicates that they have passed a judgment on them. And they elect them, it means that they accept what they did. But there is much more to do. They have already blindfolded their own people with mind games and to allow corruption to go on. To deal with corruption in Africa does not require appointing a special prosecutor with his outfit. They can't do much. There must be development ethics institutions. There must be people who are experts in ethics in all areas of life, in various areas of life, to rise up. In this way, we will be able to measure and assess our national development. Now, the information for this presentation has been taken from the presenter's book, which is about to be launched soon, entitled The Rise of Africans and African Descents to Reign in Life, Volume 1, and it's about redeeming Africa. Let us redeem Africa, Africans, and African countries from institutions, prominent Africans and politicians who do not know and understand the impact of credible ancient African history, indigenous African systems, and oppose African national development plans and agenda and development ethics to guide them. African countries don't have national, many of them, if I'm not afraid, almost all of them do not have national development plans. They don't have national development agenda, and they don't have national development ethics and expertise to guide them. And because of that, we have politicians coming with their own manifesto, and whatever they do in 4 years, another party takes over, they try to abandon them, initiate another one, because if they continue, they will say, oh, we initiated it, and they get a credit to campaign. These politicians are fooling Africans, and Africans must be patriotic, begin to understand the game, mind games they are playing, and make sure that we become patriotic, put our nations first, just as our forefathers, before the Europeans came, had a lot of prosperity, even though it was not modernized as we have now. If you want to receive this book before we launch them, inbox us and and order your copy in advance. Please give us a thumb up if this presentation has been an eye-opener to you. And if you want to continue receiving insights with Dr. Val-Addo, please click the subscribe button and press the notification symbol and click the share symbol to send to others. If you have any comment, please just share them with us. And we pray that God will bless you and bless our African countries and the continent of Africa to know the yardsticks that we need to uphold to measure our national development progress.